Hello aviators, Sky here, and today we continue our slow-paced marathon about the speedy fighter jets. The hero in question needs no introduction. It might not be the coolest or the most popular, but it definitely boasts some charisma. Meet the mature teenager. The A-18 Hornet is the fourth-generation multi-purpose all-weather combat aircraft developed by Northrop and McDonnell Douglas in the 1970s. The unusual description is complicated by an unusual name. It is mostly a carrier-based aircraft, but also a land-based aircraft. It is mostly a fighter jet, but also an attack aircraft. Yes, it can be said that it is pretty much an F-18, but also an A-18 aircraft. How is that possible? We'll dive into that right now. First and foremost, we'll examine the history of this aircraft. How and for what reason were these planes built? I've already discussed in detail the formation, as well as all the ups and downs of the fourth generation aircraft in the video about the first triad of its representatives, so we'll just skip over this quickly. In the 1960s, the Pentagon initiated a program to create the TFX, a single multi-role aircraft to be used by most of the military. The brainchild of this program became the F-111, a solid machine, but it was too complex and expensive. And by attempting to create an aircraft for everyone, the F-111 program did not completely satisfy anyone at all. In the end, it all concluded with the US Air Force adopting the jet and the Navy rejecting it, leading to the creation of the F-14. We'll get back to this later. In the meantime, a new concept was developed. Based on the experiences from aerial battles in Korea and Vietnam, a group of aviators and engineers worked on a theory of high-energy maneuverability fighting. This theory completely diverged from the old notions of air-to-air combat, a light, nimble fighter jet for dogfights versus the traditional heavy aircraft with powerful missiles for long-range interception. These ideas were supposed to materialize in the fourth-generation fighter jet made by the US Air Force. Nonetheless, by the end of the 1960s, with lobbies for nimble and light aircraft overlooked, the US Air Force decided to work on a heavier machine. It wasn't supposed to be as crazy as the F-14 and F-111, but it was still considered complex. The F-15 Eagle was the result. The lobbies for lighter jets and some military personnel were enraged, as they believed that the F-15, with all its merits, was not good enough to fulfill the needs on a mass scale. And so, the battle for the fourth-generation fighter jet continued, leading to the creation of a lighter aircraft. Under the guidelines of the Lightweight Fighter Program, or LWF, in the early 1970s, the military personnel announced their requirements. The fighter jet needed to weigh around 9.1 tons, be maneuverable, and be able to function at speeds ranging from Mach 0.6 to Mach 1.6 at an altitude of 9 to 12 kilometers. These requirements seemed pretty simple from the technical point of view, but the task became more complicated when it came to the operational and economic requirements. The plane had to be simple, cheap, and reliable. Now we can focus on one of the main contenders of this program. In the 1960s, the primary creation of the Northrop Company was the F-5. This plane was almost the embodiment of the lightweight fighter jet concept. Simple, light, maneuverable, and inexpensive. It became quite popular. Many different versions of military aircraft were based on the F-5. Its low cost became the key to the success in the global market. Thousands of fighters spread across the globe. However, at home, it did not boast similar popularity. For its generation, it was too simple, as the industry raced to build the most advanced fighters possible. By the time the new generation formed, the F-5 became too old. Nevertheless, it had potential and was never really scrapped. While a portion of the Northrop engineers worked on an upgraded version of the F-5E Tiger II for export, others thought about the possibility of making a more powerful fighter based on it. A fighter which could fit the US Air Force requirements for the LWF program. Of course, it was understood that a small tweak was not enough, so Northrop decided to use the F-5 design and fit it with the latest tech, crafting a plane with needed quality. The concept was to keep the plane's design but make it slightly bulkier, adding a couple of powerful engines as well as a few improvements to the airframe design, adding a leading-edge root extension to the front of the fuselage, increasing the lift, and improving the handling of the aircraft. Also, 2 vertical stabilizers instead of 1 were added to the tail of the plane. Unusual for the time, vertical stabilizers improved maneuverability as they were tilted to the sides. After realizing that the initial tilt was excessive, the engineers re-angled the tilt vertically. The project, labeled the P-530, seemed promising. The name was bolstered by the addition of Cobra, due to the design of leading-edge root extension. This design added an overall attraction to using the snake names for planes during that generation. For example, the F-16 was nicknamed the Viper. Eventually, P-530 barely kept any resemblance to the F-5 jet. Similarities could only be seen in some elements of the wings and the nose. The aircraft became larger, got a new landing gear, and most of the fuselage was remodeled due to the more efficient turbofan engines, which were chosen over the turbojets, even though they were larger. Thanks to the integrated design and the leading-edge extension, the wing area more than doubled. In 1971, Northrop entered the LWF program with a serious offer. The P-530, with a whole series of modifications, became the P-600, and in the finals of the aviation tender it met the main challenger, the General Dynamics Model 401. The first was called the YF-17 and the second YF-16. Within the aviation tender guidelines, 2 YF-17 prototypes were built for the flight tests. The rollout ceremony was held in April 1974, but even then, there seemed to be a lack of enthusiasm from the potential clients. Presented in the end of 1973, the YF-16 caused a stir of excitement. However, it was too early to call anything yet. The prototype made its first test flight in June 1974. It spent 61 minutes in the air and did everything as planned, without improvisation, unlike its counterpart. The second prototype kicked off its flight tests in August of the same year. This pair spent 345 hours in the air while flight testing and competing with the YF-16. The aircraft hit speeds of Mach 1.95, reached a G-force of 9.4, and flew at altitudes of 15 kilometers, or 50,000 feet. The results were good, but Northrop was being left in the dust by General Dynamics. The reason behind that was not that the YF-17 was somehow bad, but the fact that the YF-16 was simpler, easier to handle, and having a single engine meant that it needed less maintenance. Another big advantage of the YF-16 was that it had more advanced onboard electronics. The plane received a fully working fly-by-wire system. Northrop didn't trust the fly-by-wire enough, so they put the ECAS in the YF-17, a hybrid system with some things controlled by a computer and others directly by the pilot. Such conservatism was initially justified, but the potential clients were not pleased. Northrop could have modernized their aircraft, but General Dynamics already had it all. Rubbing more salt into the wound, the YF-17 flight tests revealed a few teething problems, which were not critical, but they threatened to delay the adoption of the planes. The race was over in January 1975, when the US Air Force officially declared YF-16 the winner. That seemed like an obvious conclusion for the story of the Cobra fighter, but it was only just the beginning. Now, the ripples of the sea and the smooth surface of the decks awaits us. In the early 1970s, as the Air Force worked through thick and thin of the fourth-generation fighters, the Navy was enjoying the latest F-14 jets that were being adopted. The first few planes weren't perfect, but there was no argument. Tomcat was unbelievably cool. It boasted great tech, maneuverability, and solid weaponry. Comparing it to other available fighters, it stood out by a mile, and that was the main issue. The F-14 was built as a fighter, whose mission was to defend the carrier battle groups from uninvited flying guests. Those kinds of tasks were not a problem, but any other form of combat was not possible on that machine. At first, it seemed like it should not have been an issue, since the F-4 Phantom II fighter and the A-7 Corsair II, as well as the A-4 Skyhawk, were available to be utilized as bombers and attack aircraft. However, these fighters were part of the previous generation. They were getting outdated. It was suggested to make a fighter which could also be used in air-to-ground battles. In 1973, Grumman proposed a simplified version of the F-14, while McDonnell Douglas looked at modifying the F-15 to be carrier-capable. However, the Congress was against these ideas. The budget for the creation of fourth-generation fighters was already stretched beyond the limits, and the Navy had already adopted the F-14, which was highlighted as the most expensive aircraft in history, while the so-called simplified models of the plane were not all that simple, which incurred the corresponding costs. The officials made it clear, Northrop and General Dynamics are already making simpler fighters, so choose one of those. That wasn't a bad idea. If the Air Force and the Navy chose one aircraft, then it would be possible to cut costs on unification. Even though this idea seemed good, it never came to light. It's just so that the military preferences at sea are slightly different to those on land. Shocking news, I know. Hence, both the Air Force and the Navy had different preferences, which led them to choose YF-16 and YF-17 respectively. The future F-16 fighter was a superb machine, however the YF-17 promised to be a better fit for the Navy. Certain design elements, two engines and the sturdier landing gear all played a part. As Northrop started to lose all hope, they received the Navy Air Combat Fighter, or NACF contract in May 1975. There was a lot of work to be done. Since the YF-17 was initially not built for the aircraft carrier, it had to be modified to fit the US Navy requirements. The fighter underwent many changes. The airframe and the landing gear were both strengthened, while also widening the track in between the wheels of the main support, additionally installing the equipment needed to work with an aircraft catapult as well as arresting gear. The wings were changed to folding wings while also getting larger, with slats and flaps optimized, and the fuel tank capacity increased. There were a couple of issues with the fueling system. The thing is that the US Air Force and the US Navy used different methods of air refueling. The YF-17 had to fuel with the help of a flying boom, while in the case of the future A-18 fighter jet, it received a system for the probe and drogue refueling method. The aerodynamic brake was also reworked. It was fitted right in between the vertical stabilizers on the plane, and it is integrated in such a way that it is barely visible. Since the sea can deliver a fairly rough environment, a lot of work went into choosing the specific materials, with some vigorously tested and some altogether changed. This somewhat painful process led to the plane gaining 4.6 tons in weight, which led to its max takeoff weight to just over 23 tons, or 51,000 pounds. That is quite a lot, but it was still a lot less than what its older sibling Tomcat could pull. And yes, no hybrid controls were used, as the fighter was fitted with the full-fledged fly-by-wire. While it didn't get the F-16 side stick, it was an upgrade nonetheless, and the sailors were pleased with a much better canopy view, without a complex binding like in other carrier-based aircraft. A simple but nice touch. Of course, Northrop couldn't do all this by themselves, so they called upon McDonnell Douglas for assistance. The collaboration helped both parties. While Douglas invested capital into the project and shared its experience in carrier-based aircraft design, Northrop provided the YF-17 as a foundation and managed part of the production of the future jet. Eventually, the scope of modifications and upgrades, as well as the influence of McDonnell Douglas, led to the numbering of the jet changing from 17 to 18. In 1977, it was announced that the plane will carry the name Hornet. 3 planes were planned to be made on the base model: the F-18A fighter jet, the A-18A attack aircraft, and 2-seated TF-18 for combat training. However, they all ended up to be practically the same, with the fighter jet and the attack aircraft differing only in a few onboard systems, and the combat training version just receiving the second seat. In time, they were all basically combined. Exactly for that reason, the plane was labeled the FA-18A Hornet in the early 1980s, and the TF-18 two-seater was renamed FA-18B. Sweet and simple. The flight tests began at the end of 1978, and the jet successfully completed them through quite an erratic schedule, though not without complications. Throughout the tests, the plane was slightly modified and altered, with the most difficult changes happening to the airframe, which was very intricate for the time, with the leading edge needing extra attention. All in all, the FA-18 displayed immense potential right away, being able to go through extremely aggressive piloting and somewhat masochistic trials by hitting the limits during takeoff and landing. By the summer of 1979, the Hornet concluded its main stage of test flights at land-based airfields and was sent to its new home. After preliminary preparation work was completed, the plane made its first landing on board of the USS America aircraft carrier. It was the third Kitty Hawk-class supercarrier and was considered to be one of the largest in the fleet, second only to the USS Nimitz. Prior to the arrival of the Hornet, the carrier came back from a lengthy trip and went through a maintenance checkup. And during the Norwalk qualification tests for the FA-18, the carrier came in handy for testing the ability to land and take off. These tests didn't just help to adapt the plane to the carrier fleet, but also helped to adapt the fleet to the new plane. The naval aviation developed new joint fighter assault aircraft formations. Series production aircraft started to roll out in spring 1980, and in the next few years, hundreds of Hornets were adopted by the US Navy as well as the US Marine Corps, and later even by a few foreign air forces. By that time, though, the production alliance between Northrop and McDonnell Douglas started to strain, as McDonnell Douglas took on most of the development and production side of things. Northrop created an even larger rift when they decided to get back into the market for light fighter aircraft and compete with the F-16, and designed the lightweight fighter F-18L without any elements for use on an aircraft carrier. All this while McDonnell Douglas promoted the A-18, which led to the two partners butting heads. Eventually, McDonnell Douglas pretty much bought the rights to be able to sell the F-18 on the foreign market, as Northrop completely left the F-18L behind and focused on another lightweight fighter, the F-20 Tiger Shark, which didn't do too well, but later they made the B-2 Spirit, so they didn't lose out completely. The partnership remained when it came to the F-18, however Northrop became a mere subcontractor, only delivering some parts of the fighter. During the modernization of the aircraft in line with the NACF program, after adding the fly-by-wire system, the aviators looked even further. A large part of avionics was upgraded or replaced, which led to the F-18 becoming one of the first planes to have a full glass cabin, with multifunctional electronic displays and a considerable part of the controls being operated by a computer. Adding to that, the architecture of the new avionics allowed for an easy adaptation of the fighter to various combat objectives, be it a fighter objective or dealing with reconnaissance, or even an attack-type objectives. It is somewhat ironic that finally, after 4 attempts, a multi-purpose aircraft could be built. The potential was immense, and already then, experts shared the view that in the future, this jet could replace the F-14. The F-18 is powered by a pair of General Electric F404 turbofan engines. It was initially developed for the F-15, but the Eagles got the Pratt & Whitney engines, just like those in the F-16. Yeah, the guy from PW got lucky. Later, based on the previous developments, the YJ-101 turbofan engine was created, which was placed on the YF-17 fighter. The thrust on those engines was not the most important component, but rather the fuel consumption efficiency, reliability, and their lifespan carried a greater value. The bypass ratio of this engine wasn't particularly high, but it minimized the load onto the structure. It wasn't just an interesting concept. This idea arose due to many difficulties the larger aircraft faced when they were fitted with high-thrust turbofan engines, as it ruined the engine's reliability. The F-14 fighter, with its TF-30 engine, was a good example of that. The thrust of the F404, built on the foundation of the YJ-101, reached 79 kilonewtons with afterburner, which was not at all impressive. The fiery heart of the F-16 burned nearly twice as much, and it also caused a few issues at the beginning. But later, the F404 engine proved to be quite worthy and spread across the world. Beside the F-18, the engine saw its implementation within the French Rafale aircraft and the Indian Tejas aircraft, the American Nighthawk F-117 and the Korean T-50s, not to be mistaken with the Russian T-50. Even the Swedish Gripen got the taste of these engines, as Volvo partnered with General Electric and produced a localized version of the engine, the RM-12. Today, the newest versions of the F404 engine are used in the promising training aircraft Boeing TX, which should replace the outdated T-38 Talon jet. The F404 engine can get the F-18 up to speeds of Mach 1.8 and lift the plane to the 15 kilometers or 50,000 feet altitude. These characteristics clearly show a step away from the original ideas of super high-speed flights with an exclusive use of missile interception. The prior models, like the F-14 and the F-15, could reach Mach 2.3, 2.5, and even the aircraft of the third generation would be disappointed. For example, the Phantom II could fly at Mach 2.2, while the F-18 only goes up to 1.8, around 1900 km per hour. Seems kinda pointless. But that happened due to the change in the requirements. Even though the 4th generation lightweight fighter jets were slower, they were a step ahead in all other features, not only combat related. The speed limit was influenced by the fixed air intake, without the possibility of changing its configuration in flight. Also, the wing has a low sweep angle, which produces great maneuverability and reduces the minimal speed, which helps when the aircraft is operated on an aircraft carrier, but makes it difficult to get this rig to high speeds. Most of the other planes could easily beat it in a straight line, but would lose in all other aspects. Even though the F-14 had a wider range of abilities, it was, to put it mildly, more complex and more expansive. While here, the simplicity was compensated by many positives. The lack of overcomplicated mechanics simplified the construction of the jet, which lowered its price, as well as the maintenance costs over the jet's lifetime. The A-18 got around a 6,000-hour flight lifespan, which is a very large number for aircraft carrier-based jets. Their land-based colleagues mostly have to deal with more mild conditions. The engine also carried the trend of simplicity. It wasn't just reliable while also having a solid lifespan, but most importantly, it was easy to maintain. Thanks to its placement and it being quite modular, a mechanics crew of 4 to 5 people can take the engine off and replace it with another in about 40 to 50 minutes, a task which is usually quite complicated and requires a lot more time and effort. Due to all the jet's capabilities and its practicality, it became not only a military favorite, but was also praised by the scientists. By the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 90s, a flying laboratory based on the Hornet was used by NASA for the HARV, or High Alpha Research Vehicle trials in supermaneuverability. The stargazers loved the plane in general, and it is still being used in many research projects. The first generation F-A-18 A and B jets were fitted with the basic avionics and the Hughes AN APG-65 radars. These planes were the first ones to fly under the US Navy flag in the late 1970s. By 1984, the US Marine Corps also started receiving these jets. By the end of the 1980s, the base models were replaced by the C single-seater and the D double-seater models. The aircraft received an upgrade in onboard electronics and a widened scope of weaponry, which added up to the original missiles on 9 available headpoints and the classic M61A1 Vulcan Gatling cannon. Speaking of which, there is something interesting about the Vulcan. The leading edge extension of the wing is quite thin, so nothing could be mounted in it, and the front edge lifts slightly too, which means that the standard placement of the cannon is being displaced either by the chine or by the big canopy. It all led to a quite radical but interesting approach. The cannon was placed right in front of the cabin, like in the good old times. And here you thought, what are those weird holes in the plane's nose? Finally, the rockets. The C and D models of the plane got some new toys to play with. The AGM-65 Maverick and the AGM-84 Harpoon. The names insinuate a particular focus on surface targets, be it on land or water. The multi-purpose agenda is growing. Adding to the surface-focused weaponry, the jet did not forget about the sky, so it also got fitted with the AIM-120 AMRAAM. The first time the F-A-18 got into a fight was in 1986, with Hornets utilized in the Operation El Dorado Canyon against Libya. It seems as though the US naval pilots had a relationship of their own with the Libyans, since the F-14 also had its first combat during the 1981 dogfights in the Gulf of Sidra. After all that, the F-A-18 was pretty much used everywhere where the fleet went. The Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. Metaphorically speaking, the aircraft carrier is like Uncle Sam's baseball bat, and the Hornets are the nails sticking out of it. A large leap in innovation happened when the F-A-18E and F fighters were made, both being labeled the Super Hornet. The jets were built in the early 1990s under the guidance of the program, which focused on replacement of the outdated models, such as the A-6 Intruder and A-7 Corsair II attack planes, as well as an addition to the F-14 fighters, which were so expensive and complex that the military refused to purchase new units. The Super Hornet became the new generation. Even though its design is similar to its predecessor, it got an increase in size, which you might not see with the naked eye. It gained an extra meter in length, the wingspan increased by 22%, and its max takeoff weight soared from 23.5 tons to 30 tons. The F404 engine was swapped to a more powerful F414, which gives a 25% thrust boost, now reaching 98 kilonewtons. Due to the new engines, the air intake also had to be altered, being one of the easiest to see changes of the plane. Adding to the modernization of the plane during the 2010s, the F-A-18 received optional conformal fuel tanks, which are attached to the top of the fuselage. Some versions of the F-15 and F-16 have similar solutions. The onboard electronics were reworked and improved. New computers and radars were added. The Hughes APG-73 was changed to the Raytheon APG-79 radar with the AESA antenna in 2000s. In terms of weaponry, it could carry basically everything listed under the NATO regulations. In the end, the Super Hornet not only replaced all the outdated jets, but also pushed aside the older brother, the F-14. The F-A-18 became the master of all aircraft carriers, as it was a fighter, an attack aircraft, and a scout all in one. And with the arrival of the electronic warfare variant, the EA-18G Growler, the EA-6B Prowler also stood aside, after holding that spot since the 1970s. Hornets only recently got worthy competitors, as the aircraft carriers started to fill up with the modified F-35 Lightning II jets. The rivalry between the two planes is especially evident within the political and corporate spheres. Boeing took it upon themselves to produce the Super Hornet after their merger with McDonnell Douglas, and that's where the competition with Lockheed Martin is seen. Have you ever noticed in many of the articles where the F-35 is criticized for being too expensive, unreliable, and just completely useless, the noble and impartial experts tend to rally behind such statements as, "Why do we even need this jet when there is a perfectly crafted F-A-18 fighter available from Boeing?" Check the link in the description and don't forget to use the promo code for a discount. The Pentagon isn't too happy with this situation either. Yes, the F-35 is pricey and the production is a little slow, which means that the Navy and the Marines are still using the older planes. And even though the Super Hornet is a great fighter, buying it further creates a risk of building a fleet that will soon become morally dated. Boeing knows that and is attempting to fight by developing upgraded versions of the plane that can actually compete with the 5th generation jets up to 2030s. Although the A-18s didn't become the epic bestseller like the 16s, it found its place in the US Navy and the US Marines, as well as other military structures, including foreign armies. The first generation of A, B, C, and D Hornet produced around 1,500 jets, and the second generation of E and F Super Hornet already has 600 fighters produced, with more coming. Most of the fleet is of course under the control of the US Navy. These fighters are constantly being exported, although mostly the land-based models, since none of the US allies has such aircraft carriers. The jets can be seen in air forces of Malaysia, Kuwait, Finland, Spain, Switzerland, while Australia, after ordering 75 jets, was even able to start its own production of these planes. The largest foreign operator of this jet is Canada. Other options were also considered, but the F-15 was too expensive and just difficult to maintain, and the F-16 was the polar opposite, too simple for the requirements placed by the Canadians. They even considered the Northrop's F-18L, but when the project was cancelled, the obvious choice was the F-A-18. From 1982 to 1988, the Great White North received 138 modified CF-18 fighters, which were later modernized and are still in use today. It's the Canadian fighters that are beautifully painted red, and the Canadian artists didn't stop there. They decided to paint a canopy at the bottom of the nose section to confuse the enemy during a dogfight, since it is difficult to tell whether the plane is upside down or not. At the moment, the Canadians, just like the rest of the world, are considering whether to buy the older and cheaper Super Hornet or to order the new Lightning II, which is more expensive. Funny enough, the Canadians were swaying towards the F-A-18, but then Boeing clashed with Bombardier over the C-Series and Canada froze the contract. Let's end it on a high note. While the Air Force has the Thunderbirds, using the F-16 jets to show off some beautiful air demonstrations, the Navy has the Blue Angels in the F-A-18 fighters. Enjoy the view, and if suddenly you see the Hornet above your head, let it be these guys, since they prefer aerobatics to combat. Clear skies, fast flights, and soft landings to you.